Enjoy the company hoodie and gift card, she said, her voice dripping with a smug, nasal tone that suggested her expensive dermal fillers had migrated and choked out the last remaining cells of human empathy. That was the precise moment I knew it was finally happening. My name is George Vance, and at 55 years old, I was about to become the star of a public execution. Chloe Kensington, the chief culture officer and daughter of our CEO, was standing in front of the entire staff at our quarterly all-hands meeting, ready to dismantle my career. There was no quiet discussion, no formal warning, and no private meeting in a glass office. Instead, she chose to stage a theatrical performance during our global live stream, sandwiched neatly between the announcements of new office coffee flavors and our rising operating burn rate. I stood near the back of the room, hands folded, watching her read from a teleprompter script she had clearly not written herself. George has been a valued part of our team, she cooed, flashing a bright, empty smile that did not reach her eyes. But as we pivot toward new strategic cultural priorities and optimize our operational alignment, we have made the difficult decision to part ways. She reached into a large wooden bin of promotional swag and pulled out a cheap polyester sweatshirt. My name was scrawled on the paper tag in black marker, looking like an item from a lost and found bin. Tucked inside the pocket was a $75 gift card to an organic juice bar that did not even have a location in my zip code. She added, as if it were a minor afterthought, that unfortunately, my quarterly performance bonus did not meet the newly updated metrics, so it would not be awarded. The bonus was $140,000. It was a sum I had earned 10 times over by keeping our back-end infrastructure alive. I could feel 65 heads turning in slow motion to look at me. The sales directors tugged nervously at their collars, and the row of junior designers stared intently at their phones, trying to disappear. The only person who did not flinch was our chief financial officer, who looked out the window with the glazed expression of a man who had already checked out and bought a retirement boat. I simply smiled. It was the calm, quiet smile of an engineer who knows exactly where the foundations are buried. I took the cheap hoodie, held it up to feel the scratchy material, and nodded. "Thanks for the memories," I said, keeping my voice steady and polite. I did not raise my voice because anger is the weapon of an amateur, and I am a thorough professional. I walked out of the room without making a sound. I did not slam the heavy glass doors, nor did I stomp down the hallway. They wanted a dramatic scene to justify their narrative, a story of an aging employee having a meltdown that they could pass around their messaging channels. Instead, I gave them absolute silence. As I walked out, I realized that the human resources team had not asked me to sign a single document. There was no exit interview, no non-disclosure agreement reminder, and no release form acknowledging that my termination was handled legally. They had simply deactivated my network access card and sent a brief email stating my credentials would expire at 3 in the afternoon. They skipped the entire legal process because Chloe wanted me gone immediately, and her father, Walter Kensington, was too weak to tell her no. I sat in my car and stared at the hoodie on the passenger seat. I popped the trunk, threw the polyester rag inside, and opened my personal laptop. I did not connect to the company network. Instead, I opened an encrypted partition on my hard drive and pulled up a document titled Vance Systems Integration LLC Licensing Agreement. Chloe may have thought she was cleaning house, but she had no idea that she had just pulled the pin on a financial grenade. 4 weeks before this day, I had sat in a quiet diner that smelled of grease and stale coffee, reviewing this exact file with my attorney, Diana Foster. She was 42 years old, cynical to her core, and wore her pearls like brass knuckles. She had leaned over the screen and asked if I was sure about the terms. I had told her that the company had been treating me like an hourly hand while relying on me to build their entire digital spine. It was time to enforce the insurance policy. I recalled how we spent 3 hours in that diner, analyzing every single sentence of the vendor agreement I had drafted. Diana pointed out that the company was growing rapidly and preparing for a major funding round. She warned me that when companies prepare for venture capital, the founding principles are often sacrificed for growth metrics. She advised me to ensure that my proprietary integration tools remained strictly under my control. We made sure that Advanced Systems Integration LLC retained full copyright and ownership of the underlying database routing architecture. I had spent years of my personal time developing this framework, and I was not about to hand it over to a group of executives who did not know the difference between a server and a spreadsheet. I paid Diana her standard fee and filed the agreement away, waiting to see if they would cross the line. The insurance policy was a specific licensing clause hidden deep within our master services agreement. While the executives were focusing on marketing campaigns and client presentations, I had spent years rewriting our entire databases, replacing a chaotic mess of open-source tools with a clean proprietary infrastructure. The critical factor was that this infrastructure did not belong to the company. I had developed the core integration modules through my personal entity, Advanced Systems Integration LLC, which had been listed on their vendor registry for over 6 years. The licensing agreement contained a clause 12.7b. It stated that the company was granted a perpetual license to use the system, but this license was strictly contingent upon my continued employment. If the company terminated my contract without a formal review process, documented performance logs, and a 90-day written warning, the license would automatically revoke. It was an elegant piece of legal engineering. The contract had passed through their internal legal team during a chaotic corporate restructuring, rubber-stamped by tired attorneys who never bothered to read the fine print. Chloe had never read it because she did not understand technology or contracts, and Walter was too busy managing the board to notice a standard vendor update. The clause stated that upon improper termination of key personnel, all rights reverted to the LLC immediately, rendering any continued use of the system a direct violation of federal copyright law under Title 17 of the United States Code. Section 106. I had printed a physical copy of the executed contract and locked it in a fireproof safe at my home. The digital versions were backed up across multiple encrypted servers, including a secure facility in Iceland. I did not want to trigger this clause. I had worked hard to build the platform, and I took pride in its stability. I had been with the company since its early days, back when Walter Kensington had a genuine drive to build something meaningful. But everything changed when Walter appointed his daughter Chloe as the head of culture. She arrived with an entourage of consultants, expensive water bottles, and a vocabulary consisting entirely of buzzwords. She immediately began targeting the older engineers who had built the company, replacing experience with cheap, compliant graduates who did not question her authority. She did not like that the team looked to me for guidance, and she hated that I kept records of her department's spending. Every time I pointed out a security vulnerability or a contract discrepancy, she would smile tightly and suggest my mindset was outdated. I remembered the late nights Walter and I spent in his garage when we first started building the company. We were fueled by cheap pizza and a shared vision of creating a platform that would simplify operations for thousands of businesses. Walter was a brilliant coder back then, but as the money started rolling in, he traded his keyboard for golf clubs and his passion for corporate meetings. He forgot that the real value of the company lay in the clean, reliable systems we had built, not in the buzzword-filled presentations he delivered to investors. He allowed his daughter to hijack the culture, turning a hard-working tech company into a vanity project for a social media influencer. The tension had been building for months. I watched as she slowly excluded me from architecture reviews and removed my name from key communication channels. She started taking credit for the systems I had built, presenting them to the board as achievements of her culture alignment initiatives. I did not argue or make a fuss. I simply documented every single interaction, every deleted channel, and every instance of credit redirection. I built a comprehensive timeline of events, backing up the logs to my private storage. When she called a meeting to discuss team cohesion, I brought a list of unfinished engineering tickets. She told the room that my focus was too rigid and that we needed to lead with emotional resonance. I told her that emotional resonance would not keep the database servers online when the traffic spiked, which made her glare at me with cold fury. Now, as I sat in my car, the countdown was over. I opened the terminal on my laptop and initiated a script that verified the status of my network credentials. As expected, they were deactivated. I immediately compiled a formal notice of license revocation, attaching the signed vendor agreement and the certified timestamp of my termination. I sent the documents to Diana Foster, who replied within minutes with a single sentence telling me to let the system work. I closed my laptop, backed out of the parking space, and drove home. I did not feel angry. I felt the deep, satisfying calm of a designer who has built a machine that functions exactly as intended. They had spent years assuming that the quiet professionals who build the infrastructure are powerless, forgetting that the walls they stand on are only as strong as the foundation underneath. As I drove through the quiet suburban streets, I thought about the irony of the situation. Walter and Chloe believed they had streamlined their operations by removing a highly compensated engineer who did not participate in their corporate rituals. They thought my salary was an unnecessary expense, failing to realize that the entire value of their company was tied to the software I owned. Without my proprietary database modules, their platform was nothing more than an empty shell. They could not process customer orders, they could not manage vendor relations, and they could not secure their data pipelines. I pulled into my driveway, walked inside my house, and poured a cup of fresh black coffee. I sat in my study, looking out at the quiet garden, and prepared to watch the natural consequences of their incompetence unfold over the coming weeks. The core of the problem was Chloe's complete lack of accountability. She treated the company account like her personal credit card, charging thousands of dollars for team-building retreats that were nothing more than weekend vacations for her friends. During my audits, I had discovered $26,000 spent on a private gathering in Palm Springs, which she had categorized as a corporate wellness seminar. I also found a payment of $1,350 for a hand-drum ceremony in the office break room, and another invoice of $5,800 paid to a local music producer listed as an environmental harmony consultant. When I raised these items with the finance director, he told me that Walter had approved them directly to keep his daughter happy, asking me not to create waves. But the final straw came at 10:35 p.m. on a Wednesday night, just 2 weeks before I was fired. I was reviewing the quarterly bonus allocation ledger, trying to understand why our infrastructure team's bonuses had been cut by 40%. As I dug into the database, I found a series of manual payroll overrides. A total of $24,500 had been diverted from the engineering bonus pool and transferred to a newly registered company called Chloe's Serenity Lab. The transaction logs showed that Chloe had authorized the transfer using her administrative credentials, bypassing the standard approval flow. She had forged my name on the digital sign-off sheet, claiming that the engineering department had agreed to donate their bonuses to fund her new office wellness initiative. This was a direct violation of California Penal Code Section 470, which covers forgery, as well as a clear breach of fiduciary duty. I did not report it to internal human resources because I knew they would cover it up. Instead, I printed the audit trail, the transaction receipts, and the forged authorization forms, placing them in a secure physical file. When Chloe called me into the office the next morning with Rachel from Human Resources, she did not mention the audit. She simply claimed that my negative attitude was creating friction within the department. She did not present any documentation or performance logs, nor did she offer a performance improvement plan. She simply read from her prepared script, confident that she had successfully removed the only person who could expose her financial misconduct. Deanna looked at the document under her desk lamp, her eyes narrowing as she compared the signature on the performance waiver to my actual handwriting. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "This is almost comical, George," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "They did not even try to copy your handwriting. It is a completely different style." She tapped her pen on the table. California Penal Code Section 470 is very clear about forgery, and the fact that she did this to justify withholding your bonus constitutes a major breach of fiduciary duty. She was confident that we had enough documentation to bring a devastating case, and she advised me to proceed with the notification immediately. They did not realize that their arrogance had blinded them to the legal reality. By firing me without cause and forging my signature to justify the budget changes, they had activated the revocation clause and opened themselves up to massive legal liabilities. I spent the evening after my termination organizing the evidence with Diana. We drafted a formal complaint detailing the financial fraud, the forgery, and the breach of fiduciary duty. We also finalized the notice of license revocation for Vance Systems Integration LLC. We did not send these files via email. Instead, we hired a licensed courier service to hand-deliver physical copies directly to every member of the board of directors and the lead investors, ensuring that they could not claim they were unaware of the situation. The silence that followed my departure was deafening. I did not reply to the messages from the junior developers who were struggling to maintain the servers, nor did I answer the calls from the project managers who wanted help with the API integrations. I had spent years being the person who solved every crisis, working late nights and weekends to cover for the leadership's mistakes. Now, I was gone, and the systems were beginning to show the strain of neglect. The legacy architecture was a complex web of integrations that required constant maintenance, and without my proprietary tools, the team was operating in the dark. I watched from a distance as their system response times began to slow, knowing that the real collapse was still to come. I spent my newly found free time organizing my personal life and enjoying the quiet routine of my home. I took long walks in the morning, watching the sunrise over the bay, read books that had sat on my shelves for years, and cooked dinners without the constant interruption of system alerts. Meanwhile, my sources inside the company informed me that the engineering department was in a state of absolute panic. The team had tried to modify the system configuration to accommodate a new marketing promotion, but the database refused to compile the changes without the proprietary license keys. The engineers were working 12-hour shifts, trying to reverse engineer my code, but they only succeeded in creating more errors. I listened to these reports with a detached curiosity, knowing that my involvement was completely over and feeling no remorse for the impending crash that they had brought upon themselves through sheer greed. As the days passed, the operational cracks at the company widened into chasm-like failures. Monolith Capital was in the middle of performing deep due diligence for their $75 million investment, and they were beginning to ask difficult questions. They had requested the documentation for the core processing engine only to find that the system blueprints and licensing rights were registered under my LLC. When they asked the internal development team for clarification, the engineers could not provide any answers. The database administrators tried to bypass my proprietary modules, but their attempts only resulted in a major system outage that shut down client access for 12 hours. The company tried to blame the crash on a cloud provider service disruption, but the investors were not fooled. Then came the financial audit. Monolith's analysts discovered a discrepancy of $1,800,000 in the revenue projections, which had been calculated using an outdated database model that I had warned the executives against using. They had calculated these projections using a flawed spreadsheet model that ignored our actual customer acquisition costs and failed to account for our platform's processing capacity. Without my data pipelines to feed real-time usage metrics, the finance team had resorted to manual entry and guesswork, resulting in massive errors that inflated their projected earnings. When the lead investor, Lawrence Brooks, demanded a meeting to review the operational risks, Walter and Chloe began to panic. They realized that they had no way to explain the system instability or the missing documentation. Chloe tried to organize a team culture session to boost morale, handing out customized lavender candles and sending out daily motivational Slack messages, but the engineers were too exhausted from handling continuous database crashes to participate. On Thursday evening, my phone rang. The caller was Howard Finch, the company's outside legal counsel. His voice was tense, and he tried to sound casual as he asked if I would be open to a brief consulting engagement. He told me that they were preparing for their final investment pitch and needed some light assistance with our vendor files, offering to pay me a generous consultant rate for a few hours of my time. I listened to him talk, hearing the desperation behind his formal tone. I told him that I was no longer an employee and that Advanced Systems Integration LLC had revoked all licensing rights due to improper termination. He tried to argue that the clause was not enforceable, but I reminded him that the contract had been signed by Walter and registered with their compliance department. I hung up the phone and poured myself a drink, knowing that the board was running out of time. Later that evening, one of my contacts in the engineering team sent me a screenshot of an internal announcement. Chloe had posted a message trying to reassure the staff, claiming that the technical difficulties were just temporary synchronization issues and that they would be fully resolved before the investors arrived. She had even proposed a virtual yoga session to help the team manage their stress. I shook my head in disbelief. She was completely out of touch with the reality of the situation. The engineers were not stressed because they needed yoga. They were stressed because the database was throwing critical errors that they could not fix without my proprietary keys. She was playing games while the entire technical foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. The next morning, the courier delivered the physical packets to the board members. The package contained the formal notice of license revocation, the detailed audit of Chloe's financial fraud, and the evidence of the forged performance waiver. It was a complete documentation of their failure, delivered in a quiet, undeniable format. My contact in the office messaged me that afternoon to tell me that the receptionist had delivered the packages directly to Walter's office. Within minutes, Walter had summoned Chloe and the general counsel to a private meeting, the door locked and the blinds drawn. The office was silent, but everyone could feel the tension radiating through the glass walls. They knew that something had gone terribly wrong and that their funding round was in severe jeopardy. I also spent that afternoon reviewing the legal framework with Diana. She explained that by continuing to run the platform without a valid license, the company was committing willful copyright infringement. Under federal law, this exposed them to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per infringement, as well as potential criminal liabilities. Furthermore, the board members could be held personally liable for breach of fiduciary duty if they allowed the company to operate illegally. We had prepared a federal lawsuit and were ready to file it the moment the investment pitch concluded. I was not interested in a settlement. I wanted to ensure that the intellectual property I had built was fully protected, and I wanted to make sure that Walter and Chloe were held fully accountable for their actions. The conference room was situated on the 27th floor, offering a panoramic view of the bay. The board members and the investors from Monolith Capital were seated around a massive glass table, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Chloe sat at the center, dressed in a sharp business suit, her presentation slides projected on the screen. She was attempting to explain their new operational roadmap, but her voice was shaky and her hands were trembling. Walter sat beside her, his face pale and bead of sweat forming on his forehead. At the far end of the table sat Lawrence Brooks, his face unreadable as he reviewed the documents in front of him. I sat at the back of the room, having been invited by Lawrence to provide technical clarity on the systems. I had dressed in my usual casual clothes, a simple gray shirt and dark jeans, looking completely out of place among the suits. Yet, I was the only person in the room who held any actual leverage. Chloe clicked to a slide outlining their proprietary technology advantage, claiming that their custom engine was the key to their projected growth. Lawrence raised his hand, cutting her off in the middle of a sentence. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice quiet and firm, "I want to address the licensing documents we received this morning." He pulled out the revocation notice from Advanced Systems Integration LLC and slid it across the glass table. According to this contract, the software that runs your entire platform is owned by George Vance's company, and the license has been revoked due to his termination without cause. Chloe tried to dismiss the issue, claiming it was a minor administrative detail that would be resolved shortly. But Lawrence was not finished. He pulled out the audit report showing the diversion of $24,500 from the employee bonus pool to Chloe's personal entity, as well as the forged signature on the performance waiver. "This is not a detail," Lawrence said, looking directly at Walter. "This is a systematic failure of leadership. You terminated your lead architect without a review, forged his name to cover up financial fraud, and in doing so, you invalidated the license for your core product. You are asking us to invest $75 million in a company that does not own its technology and is currently facing criminal charges for forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. The room fell into absolute silence. The company's general counsel stood up, his face white, as he reviewed the signed agreement. He looked at Walter and whispered that the contract was legally binding and that they had no defense. Walter collapsed back into his chair, looking defeated and older than his 64 years. Chloe tried to argue, claiming that she had acted in the best interest of the culture, but the board members ignored her, already whispering among themselves about emergency restructuring and legal representation. Lawrence closed his folder, stood up, and looked at Walter. "Congratulations," he said, his voice cold and dry. "You just lost your company." He turned and walked out of the room, followed by the rest of the investment team, who did not even bother to say goodbye to Walter or look at Chloe. The other board members scrambled to pack their things, shouting at Walter for allowing his daughter to ruin the deal. I stood up and walked toward the door. I did not say anything to Walter or Chloe as I passed them. I looked at the cheap company hoodie that had been left on the chair, picked it up, and tossed it into the trash can by the door. As I walked out into the bright morning air, my phone buzzed with an email notification from Lawrence Brooks. The subject line read Vance Systems Acquisition. He was offering to purchase the licensing rights directly from my LLC, along with a significant equity stake in a new venture that would replace next-gen platforms entirely. I smiled as I read the terms. They had tried to erase my contribution with a $75 gift card, only to realize that you cannot run a machine after you have thrown away the designer. I walked down the street toward a nearby coffee shop, feeling a deep sense of relief. The weight of carrying a failing company on my shoulders was gone, and I was looking forward to building something new under my own terms. I walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cool Bay air. The city was busy, cars rushing past, people walking to their offices, completely unaware of the corporate execution that had just taken place on the 27th floor. I felt a sense of freedom that I had not experienced in years. I was no longer responsible for saving a sinking ship, and I was free to build my own future. Over the next few weeks, the company assets were liquidated, and Walter was forced to step down as CEO. Chloe was removed from her position and faced an investigation into her financial misconduct. Meanwhile, my new venture was launched, and many of the talented engineers who had been pushed out by Chloe were hired to build our new platform. I sat in my new office, looking out at the city skyline, and knew that the system had worked exactly as it should.